Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on data as a tool to preserve unsubsidized affordable housing. My name is Leah Hendy, and I'm co-director of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, or NNIP, based at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. And we are really excited to share this, to be able to convene this conversation and share work from our network partners and their local collaborators. Briefly, for those who aren't familiar with NNIP, we help local communities use data to shape strategies and investments so that all neighborhoods are places where people can thrive. Our national network of local organizations in 32 cities connect their communities with the data they need and the help they need to use it to support local priorities. As a network, we engage change makers like all of you to share insights from local partners to accelerate innovation and advance equity around the country. There are just a few logistics for today's webinar. We'd be grateful if everyone would introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, and city. The event is being recorded and will be posted on the NNIP website and shared with all registrants. We encourage you to ask questions via the chat throughout the webinar. We'll be pulling those out for our moderator and making sure she sees them. And please remain muted throughout the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Laura Abernathy. Laura is the Senior Director of Housing Policy at the National Housing Trust and convenes the National Preservation Working Group. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, thanks Leah, Elizabeth, and NNIP for inviting me today. I don't have any slides, but you're not here to learn from me anyhow, so I'm going to be brief because I, like you, I'm going to be learning from our presenters today. So as Leah said, I'm Laura Abernathy. I'm the Senior Director of Housing Policy at the National Housing Trust. And like all of you on this call, I suspect, NHT is committed to preserving and creating affordable housing so that everyone everywhere can be proud of where they live. And we do that in a number of ways. We're a real estate developer and owner. We have about 4,000 units of affordable housing in our portfolio. We're a lender. We make loans to other developers doing similar work. And we're committed to ensuring that not only our properties, but others are sustainable and resilient. And so we install solar that benefits the residents who live in our and others' properties. And then we're a policy shop as well that works to advance policies and practices to create an environment where more of this good work can happen by other actors as well. And all of this, of course, is in service of our residents. So our policy work is informed by our practice as developers and lenders, and that work in turn is informed by the needs of our residents. But more specifically, like Leah said, I lead our housing policy team. And like all of us, I think I wear a lot of hats in that role. So two specifically, want to talk about briefly today. One is working hand in hand with communities to design policies and practices that preserve the existing stock of both assisted and unassisted housing. And I've been lucky enough to partner with a number of communities across the country in this work. And one thing that's true in all of them is that you need data to do this work. So in both, whether you're looking at the subsidized stock or the unassisted stock, the need to understand what it is you're trying to preserve is really critical. So one of the first questions I like to ask communities is, what is it you're trying to preserve? Because if you don't know what your existing stock is, where it's located, what condition it's in, who owns it, et cetera, it's at best difficult and at worst impossible to actually preserve it. So I'm excited to be part of today's webinar and learn alongside all of you about how Chicago and Denver are using data to preserve their unassisted affordable housing. And right now, actually, my team and I are supporting a jurisdiction in the DC metro area, which is where I live, to preserve their unassisted stock, and specifically looking at properties that are at risk of redeveloping or repositioning without going through a sale. And that jurisdiction is lucky in that they have a very effective tool. They have an effective right of first refusal already in place to protect unassisted properties that are going through a sale. But as they invest in more transit in their community, they're rightfully concerned that they'll start losing more properties through redevelopment. And our first step in that work has been to create a database of properties to show them what their stock looks like, where it is, what condition it's in, et cetera. And we're using metrics, including market measures, demographic trends, and property characteristics to classify those properties as being at high, medium, or low risk of redevelopment. And then what we're finding will obviously inform the decisions made by this jurisdiction moving forward, but it will also inform the next phase of our work, which is to design specific interventions for them to adopt to protect those properties. I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, which is just that data is really a critical part of this work. And then one of the other hats that I wear, as Leah mentioned, is convening and facilitating the National Preservation Working Group. And we're a group of housing owners, developers, advocates, tenant associations, state and local housing agencies, and others, all of whom are dedicated to the preservation of multifamily housing for low-income households. And we've existed for decades, long before I was a part of it. But throughout that time, PWG has been a trusted and unified voice known for advancing practical and actionable solutions to housing preservation. And historically, PWG has been focused on preserving the assisted stock of affordable housing, but in news that I don't think will surprise anyone on this call, the unassisted stock is becoming an increasing priority and interest for us as communities across the country really start to understand how critical that stock is and start to crave solutions to preserving it. And I think there's a handful of PWG members on this webinar today. So thanks to NNIP for extending the invitation to them and allowing them to learn alongside me and the rest of us. So like I said, excited to learn as we move through this. With that, I'll turn it over to our first presenters, from whom we'll learn about unsubsidized affordable rental properties in Chicago, and more specifically about the progress that they've made there preserving smaller buildings. So excited to be joined by Jeff Smith from the Institute of Housing Studies at DePaul University and Roberto Requejo from Elevated Chicago. So I'll turn it over to you.
I think we're gonna have Roberto go first.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Roberto Requejo. I'm the Executive Director of Elevated Chicago. And Elevated Chicago is a coalition of organizations advancing equitable transit-oriented development in our city. Our members include city and region-wide organizations such as the Chicago Community Trust, a couple of CDFIs, think tanks like MPC and CNT, and also community-based organizations located in neighborhoods with transit assets, but also with strong displacement trends due to either gentrification or disinvestment. And Institute for Housing Studies and Jeff personally have been instrumental in identifying those displacement pressures and helping form our coalition. Since 2017, we have invested about $10 million in bricks and mortar projects near transit, in systems change and advocacy, and also in storytelling and narrative change in support of ETOD. And this last piece, I think, is the one that this group will find more interesting. We envision vibrant neighborhoods where the built environment and infrastructure drive racially equitable outcomes for public health, climate resiliency, and arts and culture, but we lead with that racial equity lens, and especially we concentrate again on transit assets and how we are utilizing them or not in Chicago. And I would start by saying that our definition of equitable transit-oriented development, or ETOD, is not coming from zoning experts or city planners or urban designers. It is the result of conversations with hundreds of community residents and a very broad array of stakeholders. And what we have learned in these past 6 years is that people love the place they live when that neighborhood connects them to what they need. And so ETOD is about planning with communities, not for communities. So people of all races, incomes, genders, abilities can experience the benefits of living near transit hubs in mixed-use, pedestrian-friendly, compact neighborhoods. And ETOD looks like affordable homes, but it also looks like community centers and health clinics and art venues and many other types of development that Chicago residents are bringing to our table, and that we have assembled in a beautiful pipeline of projects that we keep helping develop and break ground. For us, ETOD is a tool to prevent two types of displacement due to gentrification and displacement due to disinvestment, which in Chicago looks like depopulation. And this map here shows you what happens when we promote transit-oriented development instead of equitable transit-oriented development. Chicago enacted an ordinance to provide incentives for TOD in 2013, but without an equity lens, what ended up happening is that 90% of the development triggered by that ordinance concentrated in those neighborhoods that you see on the top of the map, north side of Chicago, downtown area, wealthy, majority white communities, and also rapidly gentrifying ones. And in those communities, of course, it contributed to further displacement of residents. And then, as you can see, the vast majority of Chicago, our south and west sides, which are majority Latino and African American communities, saw very little or no development. So we came to the table. We said we cannot do this this way. We need to bring the E into ETOD. We show these two examples of two communities. One on the left, a majority African American community, $300 million train station, beautiful station, new, surrounded by parking lots, vacant buildings, drive-throughs, vacant land. So one example of that displacement due to disinvestment in the area and underutilization of a resource. And then on the other side is the other type of displacement, and that's Logan Square, majority Latino community that 20, 30 years ago had a vibrant business community, Latino-owned businesses that were erased, displaced by that type of development that you see on the bottom on the right side. And it's not only unaffordable for community residents, but it also, the units are very small and they don't fit the needs of those families. And what we want to see instead is more of this. This is the pioneering pipeline of development in Chicago. On the left is Logan Square again, and those are 100 units of affordable housing built adjacent to the train station, thanks to the hard work of Palenque, LSNA, Lucha, and many other community-based partners in our coalition. On the right side is an example from a disinvested community, Woodlawn, where POA, Preservation for Affordable Housing, they developed this affordable housing building with a historic Black-owned restaurant in the first floor. And so that's the type of work that we do. That's the type of work that Jeff has been instrumental in helping us support. I'm showing you this slide before I pass the mic to Jeff, just to show you that our org chart doesn't look like a traditional top-down pyramid. It's instead a set of tables connected to each other and in service of others. At the center is, of course, the staff in service of our steering committee. And then we have a number of community tables. And these are groups of residents that are located in communities near transit, and they have adopted one train station to build around that station equitable development. And in addition to those community-based tables, we have working groups, one for capital and programs, one to lead our system change agenda, and one for knowledge sharing. And that's the one that Jeff is co-chairing, bringing together researchers and storytellers and combining data and numbers with community-driven narratives to make ETOD accessible, engaging, fun. And the working group, again, is co-chaired by a local Black and woman-owned communications firm, RAD Resources, and the Institute of Housing Studies at DePaul University. We're very fortunate to have both organizations working very closely and at the helm of this working group. And Jeff is here today to tell you more about how they approach housing data to support preservation of affordable housing.
Thank you, Roberto. Let me just quickly pull up my screen here. As Roberto mentioned, IHS has a long relationship with Elevated, and our current role is really, as he mentioned, co-chair of the knowledge sharing working group with RAD Resources. In that role, we provide technical assistance and data support to Elevated and Elevated's collaborative members. And one of the key issues, as Roberto noted, is affecting the opportunity to advance ETOD priorities is displacement pressure, the way that displacement pressure looks in different neighborhoods in Chicago, and particularly what that means for affordable rental housing preservation, specifically the unsubsidized affordable rental housing stock. This is a topic that we've worked on with Elevated partners, and really a whole host of other stakeholders in Chicago. So I'll just run through some data here to kind of tell the story of how we see this affecting affordable housing in Chicago, but particularly affordable housing near transit. This is just a really big picture, taking a step back. Every city is losing affordable housing. But in Chicago, and I'm sure this is true in most places, there are a lot of different inputs or layers to that story. So one layer is geography. In Chicago, the dark blue areas here are areas that have lost the most affordable housing between 2012 and 2021. So you can see that those areas are largely concentrated on the northwest sides of the city along the lakefront. So there's a clear geographic component to these affordability pressures. There's also a market component. This is a map looking at areas with the highest housing costs in the city, the middle cost and the lowest housing costs in the city. You can see there's a kind of an alignment here between high cost areas and lost affordability. But as Roberto noted, those historically disinvested neighborhoods, predominantly Black communities, have also experienced displacement pressure due to disinvestment. And a lot of our work has tried to highlight what that looks like. There's also a housing stock component. Roberto showed some pictures of new development versus, especially in those higher cost neighborhoods like Logan Square. What we're seeing in Chicago is that, the rental housing stock isn't static, it's changing. And a lot of those changes are really affecting overall affordability. Between 2012 and 2021, the city's seen a growth in rental housing units in those 50+ unit rental properties. And those are typically new construction, market rate, unaffordable to low and moderate income households. And we're actually losing rental housing in particularly those 2 to 4 unit properties, which are really important to the unsubsidized affordable rental housing stock. Those 2 to 4 unit buildings make up, in Chicago at least, the predominant type of housing in many neighborhoods. They're the backbone of a lower cost rental housing stock. Even in neighborhoods that are pretty expensive, these 2 to 4s are typically the most affordable type of housing in those neighborhoods. Critically, they provide family-sized units, meaning there's multiple bedrooms, which is really uncommon in a lot of the new construction properties. Lots of research, ours and others, has shown that these smaller buildings serve lower income households. They're more likely to serve neighborhoods and households of color. And they're owned by owner occupants or small scale landlords, meaning they provide an opportunity for homeownership and for also wealth building. And critically, once they're lost, there's not really a current market mechanism to replace them, particularly as affordable. So when we mash up the market layer and the property type layer to see how the market factors might be driving the loss of this particularly important component of the rental housing stock, we see that citywide we're losing the stock, as I mentioned, but that loss is most significant in those higher cost neighborhoods, but also not insignificant in lower cost neighborhoods that are losing, lost 3.5% of the stock since 2013. High cost areas have lost 7%. For the elevated Chicago work, it was really important to understand what this looks like near transit. And what we found was that the loss of this 2 to 4 unit stock was even more significant or occurring more rapidly within a half mile of a CTA train station. So this just shows that citywide, 5.5% of the 2 to 4 unit parcels were lost with near transit compared to 3.4% in areas that were not near transit. Again, similar patterns in high cost areas, even more rapid loss of housing of 2 to 4 unit buildings in high cost areas near transit, and similarly in low cost areas. So this obviously has implications for housing affordability near transit. It would be one story if maybe we were building denser housing, replacing this 2 to 4 unit housing stock, but the issue is that's not the case. If you look at the most common pathways where we were losing these 2 to 4 unit buildings, 47% are lost to single family homes, and another 30% are lost to non-residential uses. So this typically is vacant land. So almost 80% of the lost 2 to 4s are lost to lower density types of housing. And again, thinking about the relationship to transit, we see that of the properties that were lost to single family homes, over half of them were located in high cost areas near transit. And when we think about the loss to vacant land or non-residential, the plurality or the most common location for those properties is in lower cost areas near transit, where 35% of the 2 flats were lost to, essentially became vacant lots through disinvestment related market pressure. So thinking about, what this means for policy and for affordable housing policy, ETOD policy, in big picture as an indicator of general lost affordability, near transit, and an indicator of the changing nature of the housing stock near transit in those higher cost neighborhoods where the market is shifting from 2 flats to single family homes. Obviously, it's an indicator of declining rental housing affordability, increasing exclusivity of the housing market because you're losing rental housing, replacing it with non-rental housing and single family homes. This is reducing the density in those neighborhoods, so that has implications for businesses in those communities who rely on foot traffic potentially. And also it just, indicates that you're a potential decrease in transit accessibility for lower income renter households that might rely on transit to get to work or to get to other parts of the city. And in those lower cost neighborhoods, it's just an indicator of the impact of long-term disinvestment. Vacant lots are much more difficult to redevelop than preserving existing structures. So it's an impediment to long-term reinvestment efforts in those neighborhoods. Again, also a reduction in density, and it also impacts walkability and also transit access in neighborhoods that really need that. So I'll pass it over to Roberto again really quickly so he can talk about some of the policies that have been trying to address this challenge.
Thank you, Jeff, for that overview. And just wanted to share with the group how important it is to move from knowledge sharing, which is very important, to narrative change, and how the work that IHS, RAD Resources, and others have done have helped not only inform, but also change policy and ordinances in Chicago. Thanks to all that work, not only we were able to make the city develop a policy plan in 2020, with 30 plus recommendations on how to improve transit orientation of housing and affordable housing and development in general in Chicago, but also to push City Council to pass a very comprehensive new zoning ordinance. And those of you in the field know how hard it is to touch zoning. And that ordinance included some provisions, not all of the provisions we wanted to do, to stop the deconversion of affordable 3 flats and 6 flats into single family homes that Jeff was mentioning, and others. I would say one of the things that we was instrumental in working with Jeff is to bring together these two narratives, like the displacement due to gentrification and the displacement due to disinvestment, because we are so racially segregated in Chicago that many folks think there are two separate things that have nothing to do with each other, right? And in reality, both types of displacement are two sides of the same coin, and the coin being white supremacy in the way that we have planned and developed Chicago for many years, because if you notice, the vast majority of people being displaced in Chicago are either Black or Latino. Other ways that we work to advance our agenda was to make zoning more understandable. This is a super obscure technical field, and it's on purpose in many cases. Experts trying to keep community residents from accessing, the power of zoning and the power of knowing, right? And so what we did is to develop slides and visuals. This was a very telling one where it showed in the middle, these are station areas, the half mile around stations in Chicago in affluent, majority white communities, where those types of housing that you all want to preserve, we all want to keep, are banned to be built. And so in some of those stations, you can only build single family homes, and not even a 2-flat can be developed. And it's pretty shocking to see it, especially in a global city like Chicago, where you have dozens of these CTA stations that are banning that type of development. And even more jarring was to show, again, thanks to the research of our partners, how the uses on the right are allowed near transit. So if you're bringing a gas station or a car dealer next to a train station in Chicago, you're going to move faster than you're trying to build a 2-flat next to a train station. And then in general, I would say in passing the ordinance, it was critical to inform folks through social media and through visuals that sort through all the words and kind of show to people, this is why we're doing what we're doing, right? This is another jarring statistics, 84 people killed by a car within walking distance of a train station in 1 year. The ordinance included several provisions to make areas near transit more pedestrian friendly. Stories from residents is not everybody wants to see more parking. Some folks are saying we want to transform parking, and we have residents saying we love seeing how parking was transformed into affordable housing. Very important for folks, their pocket, right? And sometimes we talk about affordable housing without adding the transit component. And how is an affordable home going to help a low-income family if they have to invest now in a car to access, jobs, to access, education? So very important to bring those two elements together. And then also to give hope to folks and transform that awful map that I showed at the beginning into this new map where, thanks to the work of our coalition partners, we have now 50 plus sites of ETOD at different stages of development around Chicago. And finally, I wanted just to put a plug into our TikTok channel. Again, very important to access younger folks, especially through social media. And our team member, Janice Newsom, has a section called Can You Walk There? And it's basically herself recording her walk to and from different stations. Because sometimes we think, oh, because Chicago has train stations and sidewalks, is walkable. And frankly, it is not in many cases. And it's walkable for some of us, maybe, but for a Black woman, it is definitely not walkable at certain times of the day. So that's how we approach the joint effort between bringing arts and culture and communications experts and researchers. And happy to tell you more about it in the chat or in the conversation.
Great, thank you both. And a really helpful reminder, Roberto, at the end that although a city, in your case, Chicago, mine, DC, might be walkable to some of us, that doesn't mean that it is as accessible for everyone else. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and I encourage people to keep sending them in. We're monitoring that. The first one for Jeff, and maybe this is going back towards maybe the beginning part of the conversation, but a good question from Devin Keithley. How are you defining affordable housing?
So in this case, we're using a pretty broad definition in the sense that we're looking at rental units affordable to households earning, less than 80% of the, I think it's 80% of the AMI at 30% of their monthly income. So we're working with census data essentially. So we're trying to calculate a number to show the number of units that would be affordable to those households.
Helpful, thank you. Another one, I think, for you, Jeff, from the chat, from Brandon Stanaway. Do you have information about the quality, so the types of amenities present in the units, such as temperature, how it's temperature controlled, et cetera, of the units that are being lost? And is the quality equivalent to those that still exist? Is the new construction meeting those same standards?
So for the data in terms of the properties lost, we don't necessarily have detail. We have information on the characteristics of the property in terms of its square footage, its construction type, if it's masonry or frame. We know its age, but beyond that, we don't have great detail on how well maintained the property is. We do know that a lot of the properties that were lost to deconversion or demolition were more likely to have gone through a foreclosure, which is an indicator of distress on the property. So the assumption is that they're perhaps not as great of a condition as properties that maybe continue to preserve or exist in the 2-flat stock, and probably not have as many amenities as new construction.
Yeah, I think that's the same thing we're seeing. I have a question that I'm going to ask of Roberto. So you mentioned in the beginning, and then you shared with us later on about the value of engaging people through storytelling and changing that narrative. And at least for myself, when I think of data, I immediately think of quantitative data, but it's a really helpful reminder that qualitative data is just as valuable and can move us sometimes even further in changing hearts and minds, which is an important part of this. And I think Leah shared a video in the chat to some of the work that you and your team are doing around this. I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to collect those stories and that qualitative data.
Sure. So I think the first piece of advice is just look around your organization. Like, look around your group of friends that you rely on. And if you don't have representation of community residents, you don't have diversity, you don't have that voice, that's something that you definitely need to start addressing. Because the reason that we have access to all these stories is that we don't have to go too far. They come to us every day. Every time we have a steering committee meeting, every time we have an operations committee meeting, our organizer friends, our friends who work in social services in the community, our colleagues who have personal stories about walking down the street as a woman of color in some neighborhoods in Chicago, they bring those stories fresh to us. So that's the first piece of advice, is look around your organization. And if you have those gaps, right, if you don't have the storytelling, I think what's important also is, first of all, to bring those voices in, because for us, it's not only changing the narrative, but also changing the narrators. So the vast majority of the narrative is not me or even the staff telling it, it's our partners first person or their neighbors first person, moving from the number to the implication of that number in their personal life, right? So that's one thing. The other thing, though, is also to include communications experts in your organizations and in your work, and not necessarily, and I will say with all due respect, larger type of communication firms or firms that are all about PR. That's it. That's not going to help. You know, like the benefit of working with Rod Resources for us is that it's a PR organization, it's a communications firm, but it's based in community, is Black owned, is women led. And so they have a pulse on things that these larger organizations do not have. And marrying that capacity with your storytellers and your stories in community brings those numbers that Jeff worked so hard in making real and rigorous into real change, like all the change that we were able to implement through the Connected Communities Ordinance. Because a lot of the success was not us throwing numbers at aldermen, was us meeting with the aldermen and telling them the story of our community resident and many like them, and that's what pushed forward. So that's just some of the pieces of advice per your request. And one final, one very important, perhaps the most important: pay people for their time and pay people for their stories and compensate them for that, and be open and transparent about that, and consider them the same way you consider consultants, right? It's not a $5 gift certificate for Amazon. It's a proper fee, because they are the experts and they have that lived experience that is as valuable as the technical one. So just a few of those, and happy again to tell more stories to folks offline.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you both for your time. And I think actually that note that we ended on, Roberto, is a good segue into our Denver case study. You know, I think both as you presented the work to begin with, and certainly the note that we ended on, the value of collaboration and bringing in partners and stakeholders from across, you know, Chicago in your case, but Denver, as we're going to hear about, but in any community, being really critical to this work. So next we're going to hear from Denver, where the data they've collected on unassisted stock has really informed their investment and outreach strategies. And again, I think what we're going to hear about is the role of various stakeholders in that process. So we're joined by Jennifer Newcomer from the Colorado Future Center and Jenny Rogers from Enterprise Community Partners. So with that, take it away.
Yeah, good afternoon and perhaps still good morning. I'm Jennifer Newcomer with Colorado Future Center, as Laura said, and I'm going to take you through more of the technical side, if you will, but some of the genesis, the story of how we kind of are where we are today in Denver with this effort to get ourselves into a position to preserve some of that small or the medium-sized multifamily properties around Metro Denver. So not just exclusively to City and County of Denver, but to starting off with the 7 counties in our Metro, and I'll talk briefly about some further expansion. But the origins of this work is very much so rooted in an organization in Denver, for those of you who are not familiar, that was called Mile High Connects, and also very focused. It was born around a transportation equity mindset because of the mass transit infrastructure investments that the region had approved and funded. And that work through Mile High Connects was also tied with its own regional equity atlas that existed first, and dare I say, like actual paper form back in 2011 when that was released. And it was built around a lot of collaborative insight and also technical assistance from a data and an analysis perspective. But it really married the kind of quantitative data work with some experiences and stories and direction that had been provided at that steering committee that Mile High Connects convened, ranging from community organizers to everyone, and even up into the banking, lending community and enterprise, and myself at the time at Shift Research Lab in between. And so that work evolved into developing an interactive resource that had been supported through our local MPO with the Sustainable Communities Initiative work in Denver. But then over time, that eventually kind of got long in the tooth, if you will, with the data, and it would never got into this question and this operationalizing, excuse me, where we were really thinking about other types of investment and specifically around housing. And that's when probably around 2019, and I know Jenny even prior to that a little bit, but when she and I really started talking back then, was thinking about what do we do in terms of moving beyond understanding where the regions and the states subsidized inventory is, and how are we going to, with limited resources around subsidized properties, really move to think about what can we do to leverage the rest of the housing stock, and very specifically on this small to medium sized multifamily, the 2 to 49 unit tranche of inventory. And so as the regional equity atlas was kind of decommissioning, the Spark work with Mile High Connects, that Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge that was national, Denver happened to be one of the 6 sites, it started moving into that framework around racial, climate, and health equity. And because of the support from Spark, we started thinking more specifically about how do we multi-prong support, especially the community organizers, and thinking about tenant protections in the state around, because at the time we had probably very poor compared to the rest of the country, very, very poor tenant protection laws in place. And so that started morphing this sort of next generation of our decision support tools to the table of partners. And that formed this, what we called at the time, we're not marketing people. And I think, Roberto, your suggestions are always well taken on how we think about how do we market and expand these kinds of resources and get them into something that's intuitive with our community partners. And so this community alert database, it was formed around a stakeholder group of nonprofit organizations, really through this lens of supporting the community organizing community to understand who are these property owners that control these properties that have essentially been seen as like bad actors, if you will, in the community, and how do we take what is otherwise unruly data around property holdings that are held in like limited liability corporations and figure out who are those entities all connected to. And so through that work, moving forward, this idea that community alert database started integrating more specifically into a resource that is with the Housing Preservation Network that Jenny will talk more about, and how is the transformation of both the data and how we're refining and what's useful and what is not in the database to be able to be put in practice. And that's kind of where we are today around the preservation fund that, again, Jenny will talk about, and operationalizing training resources like Enterprise's Preservation Next Academy. So with all that mouthful, just the kind of nuts and bolts aspects of what we have in the database is thinking about how we've gone about developing the data, and the data sources we use are predominantly county assessor records, but also some local governments records around zoning and RS means. I'll mention that in a second, around construction costs. And then the unsexy part of it is all the extraction, transformation, and loading process, which involves a terrible amount of data cleaning from various entity sources, because all of our county assessors are not on the same type of system. a fair amount of text analysis, which is where I'll talk about where we feel like we're adding some value, the spatial analysis that results in some derivative variables. And then our partners at our Housing and Finance Authority have generously supported the front end build to support our community partners. So as an example, real quickly, we have information like Jeff mentioned, we have information on property attributes, where they are in space in terms of parcels, but what kind of property they are, with their class codes, how large are they, the number of units, when were they built, and zoning, and what kind of density that those properties are sitting within. And then what's this ownership structure is one of the big questions, and the kind of epicenter of the effort is to understand what is the portfolio holdings of these different entities that are controlling the kinds of properties that tend to support folks who have lower incomes, and what is the tenure composition. And finally, what's the situation around the economics of the property, because to the extent that I think kind of the question that was in the chat is understanding what sort of condition the properties are in, because if you can acquire a property and they seem like a really low price deal, there could be some skeletons in the closet with respect to maintenance, deferred maintenance, and challenges around needing to do some significant mod rehab for the properties. So we've developed a variable to look at some proxy for quality even before stepping foot on a property for potential acquisition. And so how we've identified a process we don't know explicitly like what the rents are in any given property. We've set up a set of scenarios around what would be seller motivations for the properties to be more amiable to having a conversation with Ginny and her preservation team to think about either transferring ownership into the fund or becoming a partner and keeping that property in some form of affordability. And so not going into great detail here with our time, but we generate a bunch of queries around a set of conditions, and then we're able to spit out and find out where are potential properties located under these sets of scenarios, and making the otherwise pretty unruly long list of potential properties filtered in a way that could be a more approachable to be able to move on to securing them into affordability. So I'll turn it over to Jenny to talk about how that's moving forward.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll share my screen if I. You all see my screen now?
Yeah,
Great.
looks good.
Thanks. So on here, you'll see a screenshot of one of the maps that Jennifer prepared for our preservation network. And as she mentioned, that is made up of a variety of different organizations. I'm with Enterprise Community Partners. We're one of the lead organizations in our preservation network. It's also made up of our HFA, a coalition of CDCs that work throughout the Metro Denver area for the most part, but also throughout the state, and neighborhood groups, and Mile High Connects, which was our Spark and Spark organization, which is no more, unfortunately, in Denver, but was one of the catalysts for this work. So what we really did in 2019 with our preservation network is said, what are the levers that we need in order to preserve more of this small multifamily housing stock that is unsubsidized? We had worked to create a data set and strategies to preserve restricted housing throughout the state of Colorado, but didn't really know, to the point that everybody's been making so far, what did this small property stock look like? Who were the owners? What do those portfolios look like? Where are these properties, and where are they compared to areas that we know are vulnerable to displacement and gentrification? And so some of the queries that Jennifer conducted and some of the analysis that we used to then talk to policymakers, funders, our housing partners, was really taking a look at overlays of gentrifying neighborhoods versus concentrations of these small multifamily properties, concentrations of properties owned by mom and pop owners or owners, as she said, from out of state, properties that based on that analysis weren't as in good a shape as others and perhaps had been owned for a long time, and we had owners who would be willing to sell to one of our nonprofit partners. So that information was key for us to not only start designing a comprehensive strategy to preserve these units, but also to identify geographies to concentrate that effort in. And so you can see on the screen, we really looked at, what did we need to do in the ecosystem? What did we need to create? What was there? What wasn't there in order to really tackle this preservation issue that we have? And so the data is one piece, but we also created a lot of tools, training, technical assistance for our nonprofit partners. We've created and presented an entire Preservation Next, we're calling it, training series for anyone in Colorado who wants to learn about how to preserve small multifamily properties, but also we're able to raise funds to support a cohort that's working together of nonprofits that's really digging in to see how they can apply best practice in their own communities. And that might be the Denver metro area, but we have partners from across the state who have been part of that learning cohort, who also are receiving direct technical assistance. So we have organizations that have found properties. We're helping them with underwriting. We're helping them with analysis of those buildings. They've been able to receive operating grants from us to keep working on this program. So we're really just trying to break down all those barriers so that our partners can dig in and acquire properties. Alongside that, one of the things that we've done is work on policy. So with the initial data that Jennifer provided, we went to our city housing agency in Denver. We went to our state housing agencies and participated in many planning discussions, participated on panels where they were coming up with their 5-year strategic plans and made sure that small property preservation was embedded in those plans so that it was a priority for our governments. And key to that is their funding and the resources that we were going to need and our nonprofits were going to need. Alongside that, we are working, and Enterprise is actually leading on a right of first refusal bill for both restricted and unrestricted NOAA properties at the state legislature this year. We started last year, didn't make it across the finish line, and are working on that again this year. We feel like that's key to giving ourselves a little bit of breathing room to pull together the resources in order to acquire and preserve properties. And then the last piece is financing. So I mentioned that our HFA is one of our Preservation Network partners. Many of us came together, figured out what types of mezzanine debt and secondary financing we needed in order to make these acquisitions financially feasible, and came up with a pilot fund that I'm proud to say we are now expanding upon with one of our CDFIs in order to help our partners acquire properties at market value and compete with the private sector, which is really key here. And lastly, I wanted to just talk about one geography and our success there. So one of the areas that we determined was key to deploying all of these tactics is the East Colfax corridor in Denver. It's an area where a bus rapid transit system is going to be going in. So it's a TOD with a bus system site that's being developed by the city, and luckily has been delayed a little bit. So we've been able to deploy some of our efforts. We've raised funds to work with a coalition of CDCs and nonprofits, including, to Roberto's point, community-based organizations that represent residents, to come up with comprehensive strategies together and talk through acquisition opportunities as well as new development opportunities in that area. Those partners are able to use this data, front-end data set that's available through our HFA to identify parcels, portfolios, properties that they want to acquire. And then we're able to deploy not only this direct technical assistance, but also operating grants and grants specifically for pre-development work to help those nonprofits acquire properties. And so we're not only looking at this as a global solution in Colorado, but also working very closely with partners at the community level in order to concentrate efforts in key target areas, thanks to the data that Jennifer provided. That's it for us, if you want to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny and Jennifer. Really appreciate that. And a good, I think, overview and a really helpful sort of you showed us very effectively the transition between gathering data, how you got the data, what the data shows you, and then what you did with the data and the change they're able to implement. We do have a couple of questions in the chat that I want to get to, maybe going back to that data component for you, Jennifer. A question from Sam Kellen. How do you get density occupancy for multi-unit buildings? And Sam notes that municipal data in Michigan does not list the number of units in a building. So that might just be a state difference as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, thanks for the question. And it sounds like we should be very grateful that our assessors are maintaining such information. And so, yeah, we do explicitly receive unit counts on property types and have square footage and, you know, all those types of property attributes that are necessary and,
that are critical to doing this.
Yeah, and so then we calculate then that derivative variable around the dwelling units per acre on the property overall.
Okay, so it sounds just like a pretty critical difference between Colorado and Michigan. Though if anyone working in another state that doesn't have easy access to that data has any tricks or tools for how to obtain it, please put that in the chat for Sam and the rest of us. Another question then for Jennifer from Robert Damewood. How do you identify beneficial owners behind LLCs?
We don't have actual names of people. But yeah, no, that's a perfect question, I think. Thanks for asking that, Robert. What we do, just to geek out for a second, is, you know, it's like you can have 123 Main Street LLC, and it's one property, and then, you know, 475 Aspen Street, you know, LLC is another. But what we do is we run through, because every assessor, because we're dealing with multiple assessor departments, and even within the same county assessor files, you know, at some point it's always human entry into the records. And so consistency around the way the naming conventions are with the addressing. So what we do is we target in around the addressing of these common entities. So that allows us, there's no way, because even in our state, Secretary of State's entity registrations do not provide other than the registered agent's name for an LLC that has been registered with the state. And so it takes a lot more forensic hand digging to move past there. But when we've identified likely common portfolio entities through addressing, it allows us to start to dig further, depending on all the other conditions and situations like Jenny described, of where to concentrate efforts around the preservation, to be able to at least put a leg up on where we think that there's a common portfolio entity. But yeah, I think I have not heard maybe AI is going to solve that issue for us at some point, but we haven't scratched that itch yet.
Interesting. Yeah, it was a great question. And I hadn't, Jennifer, considered the role of AI here. Fascinating. But Jenny, I see you came off mute.
Oh,
yeah,
I just want to add that during the pandemic, we looked at using this data set as a way of kind of a reverse notification to landlords of emergency rental assistance, and that inability to identify their names and even phone numbers or contact information besides an address is a real barrier. One of the policy solutions that we have in Denver that's just starting to take place is a rental registry for landlords. That was a policy initiative that we actually started pre-pandemic with them, but is going to be critical for not only being able to reach out to landlords, but also to have our partners and our communities do more direct outreach to acquire properties.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Another question actually for you, Jenny. Can you please expand on the initiative to implement the first right of refusal?
Yeah, so across the country, there are different communities, states trying to implement right of first refusal laws. In Colorado last year, well, we started off, the city of Denver has had a right of first refusal, which ordinance for just the city for quite a while for affordable housing developments, not for NOAA. And it's been mildly successful. Part of the challenge is that there aren't enough resources sometimes to actually purchase these properties. But what a right of first refusal does is it allows a municipality, or it could be another entity like a housing authority or a redevelopment authority, the right to either respond to an offer for sale when a property goes on the market. So that's right of first refusal, and allows that local government a chance to provide a comparable bid or a higher price to the owner and ensure the long-term affordability of that project. And a right of first offer, actually, if a project is going on the market, that municipality, in our case, that's who's in our bill, has the opportunity to make an offer before anyone else does. So, I mean, that's the general sense. We're working through things like everyone else who's tried this has, is the timing. How long do you get to do that? Do you have to show that you have the financing available? And some tricky details that can be tough to overcome, but I think it's a really critical piece of policy.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Jenny. And I'll offer, from the national perspective, it is becoming certainly more popular, and it's wildly effective when done well to preserve properties and avoid displacement, which is of course why we preserve the properties. And like with any policy, the legislation is step one, and getting the mechanics behind it. So making sure there are other resources available, making sure that the development, I'll say industry in your community has the capacity to actually exercise that right. All of these other elements need to be in place for a law to actually be effective, and that we're certainly sort of seeing those growing pains around the right of first refusal. I'll also add, so I'm based in Washington, D.C., and we have a right of first refusal called TOPA, which is the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act, which is, I believe, the only one in the country that provides that first right of refusal to tenants. Most, like what Jenny described in Denver, grants that right to the city or their designated development partner. And here in DC, the right is given to tenants, and that's an affordable market rate luxury. That's just rental housing at large. Comes with a whole other set of complexities, but it's certainly an interesting model. We are almost at time. So I do want to thank, our friends from Chicago, our friends from Denver. I believe I should be handing it back over to Leah to sort of wrap us up. But I suspect that there are other questions as well. So I'm going to go a little bit off script and encourage everyone to send those to Leah, send those to Elizabeth, so that we can circulate those and hopefully circulate not just the questions, but the responses from, Jenny, Jennifer, Jeff, and Roberto, and the real experts here, so we can continue to learn. But with that, I'll hand it back to Leah.
Sure. Thank you all. I really appreciate your presentations and learned a lot from them. I did drop in the chat a survey if you're interested in having a more in-depth conversation or nerding out, as Jennifer said, on the data. We'd be happy to figure out how to arrange that. So you can complete that survey. We will be following up with all the links we shared in the chat via email, along with the recording to all the registrants. But yes, please reach out to NNIP@urban.org. If you have other resources to share with the group or questions for our presenters. And with that, we're at time. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day.